Really nice photos. So if we need to turn that down. Yeah, I'm gonna turn it down. Okay. Not that far. Oh, you must have pulled the cord out.
Oh, I must have. I think that's the right line. Oh, sorry.
Here we go.
Okay.
We're on.
Okay.
Right. Well, thank you so much for inviting me here today, Barry. This is great. Really excited to tell you about this restoration project. I'm the project manager of, like Barry said, I've been working on this project since about 2018, but the project's been in works. I don't know if any of you guys know John Kane, since maybe the 90s. The properties, let me get into my first slide here, but the properties were acquired in about 2002, and it took over a decade of planning, and even longer than that before we got to even move any dirt. Well, let me tell you some details about the project. The project consists of these 3 parcels of land. It's about 1,200 acres. The 2 westernmost parcels are, we refer to them with the names of the previous owners, the Emerson and the Gilbert parcel. And we've completed restoration on those 2 parcels for about 700 acres. The 3rd parcel is coming soon. We're in the planning phase now and still working on getting a bit more funding for that project, but hope to break ground in 2024. The project involves multiple partnerships, including a local agency, a reclamation district 2137, and also partnerships with the city of Oakley and East Bay Regional Parks. These lands were historically tidal marsh and dune habitats with evidence of indigenous inhabitation. And then they were diked around the turn of the century and used for a large dairy operation, and later used primarily for cattle grazing before starting construction of the marsh. The property also, interestingly enough, was slated for urban development before being targeted for restoration. So it makes it even more special, in my opinion. The project is located in the town of Oakley, with Marsh Creek immediately adjacent on the western edge of the parcel there. You'll see, the blue line coming down of Marsh Creek, and then it veers off towards Big Break. Okay, so Dutch Slough is a slough on the north end of the properties, and it's located near the confluence of the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers in Big Break. If you're familiar, you guys are probably more familiar with the area than even I am. I'm out of Sacramento, just a much. The project is majority funded through the Department of Water Resources. That's where I work. I failed to mention that as well. And is intended to meet a program mandate within our department for the Delta Levees program of having a net habitat improvement in the Delta. And the project has 3 main overarching goals. The first being to benefit native species by reestablishing a natural ecological network, especially for Delta species currently in decline. Goal number 2, contribute to scientific understanding of ecological restoration in the Delta. And 3, to provide shoreline access, education, and recreational opportunities. That's something to get excited about for folks out here who live out here. Okay, so, I'm progressing in my slides here. Okay, good. We're on the same page. So just to explain a bit more about how the project was designed. It was designed to be a living laboratory. It was designed under this adaptive management framework and intended to be a living laboratory. It includes marsh cells of differing elevation and differing size. As you can see depicted in our concept design, that's in the top right corner. the different colors in green. That indicates that they're different elevations. One's a lower marsh and one is categorized as a mid-marsh. These two things, elevation and marsh plain size, are thought to be the most important aspects affecting marsh restoration, both for feasibility of restoration, the habitat function, and the cost, essentially, too. The bigger it is, and more cost. The project is primarily a tidal marsh restoration project, but it also includes a mosaic of other habitats, including subtidal, a non-tidal marsh, meaning we operate it with pumps behind levee, riparian, that's your trees and shrubs right along waterways, and uplands, other grasslands, things like that. We even have a historic vineyard on our project site that was built on a historic dune and also has relic dune habitat on it as well. It's the little square cut out on the design at the top there. And then these are also just some cool aerial photos of the project kind of mid-construction. You can see it's not quite reached yet. This one in the left corner is at Marsh Creek, right along the regional trail. There's a bridge there now. And this photo on the right in the lower corner, that's our Gilbert parcel, the centermost parcel. And you can see it looking over at Oakley and Mount Diablo in the background. All right, next slide. So, like I said, I started in 2018. I kind of got here right as we were putting shovels in the ground. And it was a huge construction project. So I just kind of want to share a bit of like what all went into constructing the project. So first, the site had to be graded to put it at tidal elevation, because either you know or you don't know, the Delta has a lot of land that's really low and is protected by levees, right? So this land also is low and protected by levees, but maybe not as low as some of the lowest lands that are in the Delta. So it was suitable for restoration. So first thing they did was grade it, and to do that, they were bringing up elevations of land where it was low and bringing down elevations where it was high. So they moved about 2.5 million cubic yards of material that was on site to bring it to the proper tidal elevations. And then carved channels and habitat berms and things like that. And also, like I said, this is to be a living laboratory. So we installed things like sampling platforms to help facilitate research once it was built. This grading alone took a solid 2 years plus a couple of months. And it looked like a major housing project. I got a lot of comments when I was out there from the public about like, are they building more houses? And people were really pleasantly surprised when we told them, no, we're building marsh instead. But needless to say, this was a really highly engineered project. Okay, next slide. So then things started to get really fun. This is where we started to take our blank slate of marsh plain and turn it into an actual living marsh. During early construction, we had planted these tule nurseries. You can picture, if you will, it sounds very fancy. It's basically like a tule lined ditch that we were able to take plugs of tules. They grow by rhizomes or underground root systems. So we can pull off chunks and plant them out on the landscape and end up with, put a little water on it and end up with tules. Sounds real simple, we did that on a grand scale, essentially. We planted about 25,000 tule plugs. We never quite counted how many miles of irrigation piping we put out there. I have to think it was at least a few. We brought in water and flooded it up like a managed marsh for about 1.5 years, so we could get those tules to grow. And the purpose of doing that was to stabilize the soil. So when we opened the levees to tidal action, the site didn't just wash away. It was stabilized by those tules. And we got to work really closely with River Partners. River Partners was the one who did our whole revegetation effort, and they're still out there today maintaining it. And we did all this planting through the pandemic, so kept things really interesting for us. Okay, we move on to the next slide. All right, so in addition to planting all those tules, like I said before, we have a mix of habitats out there, not just a big stand of tules. We have higher ground, and this is where we planted our high marsh and riparian and grassland plantings. So your grasses, forbs, shrubs, and trees. Yeah, so we contracted with local native plant nurseries, even more irrigation lines put out. We had different irrigation systems to flood up the site for the tules, and a whole different elaborate system with drip irrigation to keep our higher elevation plants wet. As you know, it's hot and dry out here and windy, and that dries out really young plants really fast. And we did all this through the drought. This would have been really nice to do over this winter, planting all these things. So the totaling there for all these grasses, trees, and shrubs, there's about 40,000 plants, and still more being planted. So yeah, these pictures kind of give you an idea of, like, you know, this was the day plants were dropped off, and this is just pallets upon pallets of grasses, little grass plugs about that big, with more and more racks of them being ready to be put out. The photo on the right down on the left shows the biologists working out where to plant things at the appropriate elevations. You can see it's kind of, the marsh is off out of the picture, and this is higher elevation right next to the levee there. Yeah, all right, next slide. All right, this one I add in there, just, I'm not a botanist, I am a biologist, but I just gotta have some really cool photos of plants in there. And this is Molly Farrell. She works a lot with the resource conservation districts and deals with our revegetation and our long-term management planning for this site. So she's standing proudly there with one of these sycamores that you saw her in the picture before getting delivered and being a tiny baby. Yeah, so just some cool plants. This one on the bottom is a native plant. It's woolly rose mallow. I really love that one. Okay, next one. And the last phase of construction we did was building 2 public access bridges and breaching the site in 5 places. We also took out some internal project features that were just for the function of keeping it wet before we breached it as well. But what to look for in this photo is the green boxes are all the locations we breached the site. So we did 4 of them on the westernmost parcel, and you got Marsh Creek, that real linear, straight up and down channel right there. So what the project did was reroute this, the mouth of Marsh Creek through the project site. So instead of it just this linear line that spills out at Big Break, now it's breached into the site and goes through all the sinuous channels and out Dutch Slough at the top there. And then this other feature that looks like a big lake, that was an area we used for a lot of source of fill material for the marsh. So now it's really deep water. It's called subtidal open water. We breached that in 2 locations. And then on the center parcel, we breached it in just 1 location.
Sorry, question.
Sure.
On that map there, the green boxes are the where your breaches were done. I'm sorry, what were the red ones?
The red ones were, I had taken this presentation from one I'd given before, but they're just internal water control features that were used when we were in our Thule cultivation phase, we called it. We were operating all that land like a big managed marsh. So we had these big pump systems and we brought in water, kept all the Thules wet for about 1.5 years, and then we breached it. Took all that equipment back out of there. There was some access roads, those other lines and things like that. That got finished during that time frame as well. And we had a certain order we were gonna do this project in, but that was another thing that we got thrown for a loop because all this was done during COVID. There's major delays on our bridge components and things like that. So we never had a dull moment when we were putting this together. And in this presentation, maybe we can link it somewhere later or something like that. I have links in here that are the project information. I think I skipped past a couple of those, but on this slide, there's a couple of really nice videos that my department put together to celebrate the milestone of the breaching of the project. So I'd encourage you to check those out. Yeah, let's go to the next slide. Yeah, and this next slide, I just want to show you a couple more really cool photos of the breach of, this is the breach at the, maybe go back to 1 slide just for a quick second. Okay, so the photos that are coming up next are the breach that's at the very north end of the project. This is the largest breach we did into Dutch Slough. It's about 200 feet, and the rest of the breaches were somewhere about 100 feet of a breach. So yeah, go to the next. There you go. Yeah, so super cool aerial photos of the breach. This is kind of getting to the tail end where they're taking the last bit of material. You can see how wide the levee was as they were taking it out. The bridge was fully supposed to be in there already, but we managed to get the piles in there because the order of operations was to build it all on land and then to pull all the land away from the bridge to help with environmental impacts. So we did the impactful in-water stuff and then waited for our bridge decks for 6 months later than we expected them or something like that. Yeah, so just a big effort. And just, it was really cool watching this crane come in on the barge and put our bridge in when it finally arrived. It made it even more like of a celebration. Okay, and so now that we had the project built, it was breached late 2021. Bridges were in place early or spring 2022. But now that it's built, what can it tell us about how we did, right? Did we build a functioning marsh? How did the wildlife like it? You know, things like that. So luckily there's a plan for that. We have an adaptive management plan. Next slide. Yeah, so a group of biologists got together and worked on this plan for quite some time. I don't remember quite how long, but finalized it in 2016. And they highlighted different things that should be studied from this project that would help inform future restoration projects. And what they identified as the 4 main objectives are to test the effectiveness of the restoration, to understand how the habitat is functioning, What more can we learn about potential toxics or water quality type things that could potentially be public health concerns? And finally, my favorite part, to provide a place for field scale research opportunities. And again, if you want to learn more about the details of this plan, it's like 160 pages long, but I included a link on there as well. So let's go to the next slide. So I'm going to talk a bit about, we have a lot of different studies going on out there. So I'm going to try to summarize what we have going on there, what they've learned so far. We've gotten some preliminary results as well that are really exciting and interesting. So, so some of the research from our adaptive management program, the researchers include departments at UC Davis, UC Berkeley, Rowan University. It's a university on the East Coast. I hadn't heard of it before they contacted us either. USGS, Kramer Fish Sciences, and Hydro Focus. And as these research projects actually got started before the breach, so they could tell some information pre-breach versus post-breach, which makes sense for some studies more than others. But let's see, let's go to the next slide. So I'm going to start with what we've been doing for aquatic monitoring, because the first major goal of the project was to create habitat for at-risk native fish species, primarily. I mean, it's mostly for all species, but here we're talking fish. So our aquatic monitoring program is based on this Baki design, before-after control impact. But since the project site was pasture and no fish could possibly be there before, the before was when there's water in the channels, but it wasn't breached yet. And you'd be surprised to learn there were actually fish in there. There were people helping put fish in there, unfortunately, that we didn't ask for, but birds do it too. Birds bring in and drop fish and stuff like that too. So it is interesting to, like, when you think you don't really need some information like that, that you actually do learn something from it. So the after started after the site was breached. And we're utilizing 3 different sampling methods to look at the aquatic environment. And these studies go really well together and really, support the different sample types to where it just makes each data set stronger. So the 3 different methods are traditional beach seining. If you go to the next slide. Yeah, so this is beach seining. You take a net along the bottom and scoop it up and catch everything in your path, right? And it gives you a sample of what the fish community is there. This is a photo on the left during construction when we're building these purpose-built sampling platforms within the project site. Yeah, go to the next slide. So this is just another slide showing those integrated sampling platforms within the site. All the yellow dots are where sampling platforms are located. And the reason we put those in there is you can imagine dragging a net like that would be hard to drag through a bunch of vegetation. So these were put in there as a way of having a clear spot and a consistent. You go back to the same spot and sample at the same spot. Okay, next slide. Our next sampling method is, now we're getting high tech here. There's the old school method versus like cutting edge sampling here now. So this is called the aquatic habitat sampling platform. It's a boat with a net in the front that doesn't have end that catches fish. So basically the fish are funneled through the net and under the boat across a camera, and pictures taken that can be processed later in the lab. And theoretically shouldn't, impact fish as much as being caught and handled and things like that. The reason someone even went to the length of developing something like this is it's really hard to get permits with regulatory agencies to sample for fish because of really impacted species like Delta smelt. So this is a way of getting around that. So we don't have a lot of data from this yet, but let's see, there is one more slide that shows a little bit more detail about the sampling platform. Yeah, so here's some examples of some photos it takes of the fish as they're passing through the camera system. It's also time-stamped. And they're also taking a bunch of water quality sampling. Things like temperature, dissolved oxygen, salinity, turbidity, pH, how salty is the water, things like that. So for the first time, we can see what and how many fish are where in what kind of water. Sorry, I took that from a colleague. I'm not sure what that means, but all right, let's go to the next slide. So the last aquatic sampling method we're utilizing is really on the leading edge of this work. It's using environmental DNA. It's a relatively new technique that can identify fish species and fish community by detecting their DNA in the water. The science is evolving rapidly, and the number of agencies, companies, and universities utilizing these techniques are growing rapidly. So the water at the sites pumped through a glass filter, and DNA is isolated in the lab. They use barcoding, uses genetic markers to identify the species. So basically, how this was described to me is kind of the same way our COVID tests work, is how the DNA is sampled and processed in the lab. I thought that was kind of interesting. It gives it's not as quantitative of data as you can imagine, since it's not counting individuals of fish or anything. But it does help pick up more rare species, say, things like that. And then coupled with the other methods, if you're getting consistent data across your seining and your other fish sampling methods, it just helps solidify those results. Go to the next slide. So this just kind of shows the sampling route for the aquatic sampling. They're sampling in the channels, but they're comparing it to the outside channels that have always been there for a control set. And let's get to the next slide. This is a more exciting slide. Here's some preliminary results. This is from the eDNA work. And the thing to look at here, I'm not going to get in detail. All this is provided by researchers too. So if you have a really specific technical question, I'm not the person to ask either. So what's really cool on these graphs is that the eDNA picked up some of our rare native species in the site. So we can already tell that our native fish species are using the site. So yay, job done. So we got Chinook salmon up there, green sturgeon, longfin smelt, rainbow trout, Sacramento blackfish, and white sturgeon. And the graph on the right there shows what time frame their signals were picked up in, to show what kind of seasonal use these fish species are making of the marsh. Let's go to the next slide. So moving on from aquatics, we have scientists out there looking at a bunch of different species of terrestrial animals. And it's part of a bigger study. It's not just at the Dutch Slough site, it's at all these sites that DWR owns throughout the Delta. Dutch Slough is just one of them. So this is something, this biomonitoring, so it's your birds, your frogs and turtles, insects, bats even. They're looking at all the different taxa of what's considered terrestrial species. And this helps us understand species response to habitat management activities, to climate change events, to the vegetation structure we're using in our design, and other adaptive management strategies. Okay. It says there's 150 sampling sites from Dutch all the way up to the Casumas River Preserve. Okay, next slide. And here are some results from this terrestrial monitoring. They're kind of all lumped together. And the interesting thing from this data is that Dutch Slough is showing to have the greatest species richness of any of our Delta sites so far. And it's still in its infancy, so that's a really exciting thing for us. So just trying to explain, once again, somebody else's graphs. The chart on the left here is showing a response of these different types of species to these different types of cover. And the positive symbol is a trend where if there's more cover, there's more species associated with it. And down here, this graph, average avian species richness, it has labels of different habitat sites. Dutch Slough is the second one from the left. As you can see, it's highest on there, so it's showing that it has the highest avian species richness of any of our sites. And the graphs on the right are just basically showing an overall relationship of the more covered there is, the more species we're seeing, which seems pretty logical, but something we want to solidify. So, but we aren't just studying critters out there. We have other scientists from Berkeley looking at carbon sequestration potential of the marsh. They're looking at carbon flux at a large scale to answer the question, how do tules sequester carbon and build peat? See. Their research is primarily conducted through eddy covariance tower. This is what's in the picture here. It has sensors that can measure the fluxes of carbon dioxide and methane between the wetland and the atmosphere. They also have other sensors on there that measure wind and turbulence and fluctuations in other trace gases. So every 30 minutes, measurements track the net exchange of wind of the tules. These net carbon fluxes are the balance between photosynthesis by the plants and respiration by the roots and soils, and the balance in night and day measurements. So a little data from them as well, if you move to the next slide. So these researchers at Berkeley are super excited because Dutch Slough is showing to be in the top 1% of wetlands in the world to sequester carbon. I guess it's even more, not just important that wetlands are a really good carbon sink, But the tidal aspect of the project is additionally beneficial, and that's what they're finding out through their data. I can't quite remember why these cool images are on here of the cheese and the beer, but which is unfortunate because I'm sure that's the main point of it. But Dutch Slough is over here in the left corner, and the negative numbers are the bigger flux, the bigger carbon sink, and we're doing really good at the tip of the bell curve there. All right, let's get to the next slide. So we have other researchers from USGS also looking at carbon sequestration and other things, but they're looking at it at a much smaller scale. They're looking at individual plants. So they're looking at tidal marsh evolution on a smaller scale. They measure elevation and vegetation colonization using drones to collect high resolution and multispectral imagery. And they'll create digital elevation models to make topopathometric map, which can be compared to assess accretion, which is the development of soil over time and vegetation change. So they quantify a soil using bulk density and soil cores. That's what, this is Scott Jones of USGS over there. Height of pandemic, as you can tell, wearing 2 masks outside. But this is a soil core from an area of marsh on the site that's been there like forever. So super old. So that's a really beautiful soil core of really historic marsh, and that's just a close-up of it, seeing all those little bits and pieces of tules. So just to kind of explain the concept of soil accretion, because I think it's really important for the project to understand the project or other projects going on. You hear a lot about, so, you know, lands being low in the Delta and subsidence, right? That the lands keep getting lower. And that's because they used to be these marshes, and then they were diked and dried and farmed, and they were made of soil that are basically broke down tules over time. And it's really, when it gets dry, it really flies away and disintegrates really fast. So the land keeps getting lower. So the idea, putting a marsh back in, is that the tules will grow and die each year and keep doing that. And that process over time builds soil back up to build the land back up and help protect low-lying areas. I feel like the time's getting late. Is this okay? It's a bit longer than I expected. Yeah, okay. Okay, cool. Yeah, so this is another, oh, go to the next slide there. Another example of USGS's work and how they're looking at the individual plants. They created these chambers to isolate a patch of tule or a patch of grass in this lower photo here, to understand how the individual plant is taking up carbon. And this cool graph right here, they're also measuring a lot of water quality parameters and water levels. And so they had a sensor out, and that line was the water level pre-breach and then right at breach. So that's showing you the tides immediately doing their thing. So really like that, it really paints a picture. Okay. Let's go to the next slide. So some data from their work. This is a fun summary illustration. So what they're finding, they compared our marsh sites to the site that we haven't restored yet, that's still an irrigated pasture land. And they're finding that the marsh is taking in nearly 10 times the carbon that's emitted on the neighboring pasture lands. So this over here labeled burrows is active pasture. I like the addition of the cow for, yeah, cow farts. Yeah. And then, yeah, the marsh is just really being a rock star and taking in carbon. And the reason these wetlands are so important is because it has a way to lock the carbon in the ground, in that water. It's the component of the plants being in the water that keep it stored. Okay. So why are we doing all this fantastic research? I mean, it is fun, but it does serve a purpose. Let's go to the next slide. Oh, you got it? Yeah, so the collaboration and research, these are tools to inform our decisions going forward and helping us to maintain a resilient habitat. So it can also help us inform things like stressors such as climate change, help us understand rates of sea level rise, carbon storage or emissions, drought impacts, salinity and biodiversity changes. That give us tools for how we implement and manage resilient restoration projects in the future. Okay, so that is the end of kind of the overview of some of the research we got going on. And then getting to a topic that it gets at our third goal is creating shoreline access. To describe that, some background in the project: when the land was purchased for the purpose of this project, there are agreements made between DWR and the city of Oakley. And the roles were defined as DWR building the restoration and the city implementing trails around our project, around our restoration project, and building, and they got 55 acres of land in the center there to build a community park. So trying to orient you on the picture, if you're not familiar, that the green is where the Marsh Creek Regional Trail already exists. Hopefully you've been on it, and then it heads off towards Big Break to the left there. And then the idea is to expand that trail system into the project site. With the red line, that the only reason there are different colors is there's different commitments as far as East Bay Parks is to take on the red line up to Dutch Slough, and the city of Oakley completing the loop around the project site and connecting it into a city park property. Okay. Oh, and you saw on the previous slide, this is why DWR built 2 pedestrian bridges to help facilitate this trail system. So one at that junction at Marsh Creek down in the southern end, and then up at Dutch Slough up at the northern end. Currently, DWR is working with the city to develop the trails, but not a lot of project progress has been made. Mostly, the city needs access to development and long-term management funding. However, the city is currently reinitiating their park master planning effort and just had a second meeting yesterday to highlight some concepts that came out of an initial planning meeting. So if you're interested in access to the site in general, and want to see certain types of access prioritized, things like trails, fishing, community gardens, anything like that, I highly recommend getting involved and telling the city what you'd like to see out there. I included their link from the website that can keep you up to date on any of their meetings coming up, and this QR code is a link to a survey where they're requesting public input. You'll see it closes off August 11th. So I encourage you to look into that and tell your friends and, and let them know what you'd like to see out there. We're trying to work with them on getting the trails going first. The park's a big plan that will be phased out anyways, and hopefully we can get folks out there sooner than later now that we've got the restoration done. That is the goal. So that's where I left the presentation. Feel free to start throwing questions if anyone has anything. Thank you.
So that QR code, how can you scan that and take that survey? And give them some input?
I think if it's just up on the screen, like you can just put your camera up to it,
Yeah.
like up there.
Like if you go to take a picture of it and just hold it up
Oh,
there,
you can do this, so you think-
Yeah, yeah,
a link should pop. Oh,
no, no, but it's great. Yeah, they're taking input and really trying to put that to use for the park.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you know of any other plans to replicate this sort of activity or project in other areas around in the Delta?
Yeah, so the Department of Water Resources has a few different projects in the works. Not as much like right in a general area, except for our build out of the third parcel. That's about another 500 acres. Like we did about 700 there. But the parcel that's kind of cut off here in the photo, we refer to it as the Burroughs parcel. The Burroughs family owned most of that land previously, but so we're going to build that out. That's all that's currently planned in this area, in this vicinity.
Well, we had a chance to walk out there. They had it open, that red trail. We went out there and had to look around. And
Nice.
I say, y'all did a great job. I mean,
Cool.
I'm no naturalist, so I wouldn't necessarily know what a natural to the marsh looks like, but it looked totally natural to me.
No, yeah, it's great. Yeah, we're really pleased. River Partners that's all credit to River Partners. They've done an amazing job out there, for sure.
Do you know what River Partners, like, their long-term management plan is for this? Are they gonna, they're like,
The long-term management plan for
Yeah.
this site
for this site,
particularly,
yeah, are they gonna stay here for 10 years?
we really
forever?
hope so.
Okay.
That's our goal at DWR. We have a long-term management program that covers the Dutch Slough site and our other habitat sites as well. But since River Partners is so familiar with the site, they're the ones who built it and put it in there, it would be the best for us to keep them on. You know, the state has certain processes, so we will go through those processes, but that's the goal, is to keep them out there long term. Yeah.
And, you know, because we are friends of Marsh Creek, or shit, I was just fascinated by the whole concept of, you know, the Marsh Creek almost creating its own little estuary within an estuary, so you get, you obviously get the silt from it, you get more fresh water that's seasonally.
Mhm.
And is that helping out, like, you know, I was looking at the, you know, the Chinook salmon, you know, is that like a nice little transition zone for them to be in?
Yeah, I mean, that's the concept, is that it can be kind of a holdover place for salmon that are moving in or out of the system. It's kind of interesting this year being one of our first years watching how Marsh Creek does bring in material during the winter, because it was rocking and rolling. Yeah, that's for sure. It was pretty intense. Yeah, there's been a bit of an evolution of, you know, some soil moving in different places within the site. Unfortunately, it also brought in an influx of trash from Marsh Creek. So
That's.
we're a little bummed about that. I know, that's so disappointing. Yeah, you're spot on as far as like what the concept was of bringing it through the site.
Is there, that's that kind of, you know, source site dumping and soil and stuff coming down from ground, is that planned in there, like, for the Because those sinuous channels that there's a plan for those to move. Is that what you guys are kind of expecting?
Not significantly. So how it's been explained to me is kind of thinking about different soil types from this system versus restoration that's been done in the bay, because we kind of took a different approach than a lot of projects do. It's a more costly approach, planting out the site before breaching it. But a lot of the soils in this area are really sandy. Would have been hard to just let the site basically self-restore, say. So that's why it was pursued to do it in this way of vegetating. And it's going to have some evolution, but I don't think there is anticipation of like dramatic change. That the channels were dug really deep and a certain wideness, because there's a concept of having certain velocities that help keep other problems out, like aquatic weed problems, unfortunately, are completely silting into where like the channel doesn't exist anymore, and things like that. But yeah, out in the bay, they have more of these bay muds, and there's a lot more restoration where they just kind of like rely on scour to carve its own channels.
Is that, I know DWR has a project, I don't know if you have this worked out this year, you were gonna feel like, I don't know.
I didn't make it this
Okay,
year. Yeah.
but the DWR site that we field tripped there was another one of these like wetland marsh with levee breaks. I'm forgetting what it's called though.
Darn.
I was just trying to remember if it was also kind of like this silty sand or if they had more mud. It was up, it's the site right under Davis. I can't think of the name.
Puda Creek?
I'm sorry?
Puda Creek?
I don't know.
YOLO? Like the
It's
causeway?
kind of like a yellow, yeah, like right, it was like 15 minutes south of Davis. I'm blanking what it's called, but I was just curious.
Lookout Blue?
That was probably was it.
That was someone in the Zoom.
Yeah, I was like,
Man.
I don't know. We keep guessing all night.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not super familiar with that project enough to speak to it, to know. Sorry about that. Is there anything else? Anybody on Zoom asking a question or?
No one's asked
Okay.
anything.
I just had one question because River Partners is, and we actually, or you have another phase to do out there. I know we've gone out with the Resource Conservation District and Health River Partners plan. Is that sort of, is already have volunteers go out and plan? You need the future monitor, health monitor at least, is that going to be ongoing? Is that?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's part of the plan to get out volunteers for all sorts of different things, planting, helping to clean up, of course, different things. But educational opportunities too, hoping to really partner with some teachers and get some kids out there and things like that.
That's just my questions. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Eye opener.
Yeah, it's hard. It's such a big scale project. It's hard to summarize in 10 minutes. Forgive me, but thank you.
Thank you.